Hello, welcome to the 8th season of the Nutritionist webinars. My name's Marianne Fessenden, and I am your host for this series. Our theme this year is heat stress. The speaker for May 11th, 2023 presentation is Dr. Tom Tylutki, CEO of AMTS. He will discuss background and biology in his talk about heat stress and the effect on the animal.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to the 2023 webinar series. So, as all of you are aware, this whole series this year is going to be related to heat stress. And I'm going to start with some background and some biology, I think, and then it'll be a fun series with the people that we've got that are going to be presenting this year. It'll be anywhere from some pretty deep biology to some practical, what do we look at for soakers and fan layouts and waters and things like that. So welcome back, and let's get started with the first one of the year. So we're going to go through some general concepts, heat gain, heat loss, the thinking behind that, what we use within the Cornell model, this effective temperature index versus a relative humidity index, differences between and what happens when animals reach lower critical or upper critical temperature, what kind of physiological shifts occur under heat stress. And I say under stress because there's very similar patterns that happen regardless of the stress type. A little bit about environmental sensitivity by age and breed, some intake versus physiology shifts, some of the newer data that's come out in the last several years. So when we think about how the animal, any animal or any building, and that's a great thing to consider, we can really think of the animal as a wall if you do any construction, where heat is always trying to go to cool and cool's always trying to go to warm. Well, in terms of an animal, we're always moving that from a hot area to a cool area. And there's several different methods that this can be done. There can be radiant heat loss or radiant heat gain. Okay, so sunshine, sunlight, infrared rays, heating a surface. There can be convective heat loss, which is basically heat that's moved through air, okay, and then conductive, which is materials touching each other. So think of a cow laying in a stall. All of that surface area of her lying in the stall, all that heat's trying to move through her into the stall base, into the bedding area, and like that. So those are our primary flows of heat. And when we make this look like a cow, okay, I'm no artist, I'll never admit that, but that is my cow drawing to represent this. So we have our heat sources from the cow: fermentation, metabolic heat production, so just normal metabolism always generates heat. And within the animal, there's internal insulation, so her whole body mass, muscle, fat. Think of all the water that an animal is. Those act as pathways for heat to move, but also they will act as insulation. For example, we know in beef cattle that a beef cow with a body condition score 9 on a 1 to 9 scale has greater insulation than an animal that is a body condition score 1. Okay, that's just insulation principles to begin with. And then we have the external insulation. Now, this gets a little interesting in that it changes how we think about wetting cows, cooling systems, and like that, because the hair coat is kind of an insulation, but it's really not the hair coat that's the insulation. It's the dead airspace that's captured within the hair coat and at the skin surface. So if we have a thick hair coat, there's a lot of dead airspace, and that's a really high insulation level. If we take and wet an animal, okay, so soak them, that disrupts that dead airspace and gets the water right to the skin level. At the same time, that's going more with evaporative cooling, so there's a lot more heat loss possible because of the phase change from going from a liquid to a gas with water. But even if we think about wind exposure under cold stress, we get that wind that's penetrating that dead airspace. Okay, so that's why we always think about keeping animals under cold stress dry and protected from the wind. At the same time, we have some evaporative heat loss from sweat, or in cattle, the majority of that evaporative heat loss, as you'll see, is from respiration. And then we also have solar radiation, and sunlight exposure can have a really big impact, and I'll talk a little bit about that. So this effective ambient temperature is some of the old terminology that's used. It's really, this general concept that we're trying to bring all the different environmental factors into one number to try and evaluate the heat load on an animal. So it includes, what's the temperature, or what we call dry bulb temperature, which is what we normally use. So it's air temperature, relative humidity, thermal radiation, or hours exposure to sunlight, air movement, so fans, wind, whatever. What surfaces is the animal in contact with? That again, we'll talk about a little bit. Precipitation, is the hair coat dry, or is it wet, or is it covered in snow? All of those have different impacts on this effective ambient temperature. The most common that we hear about is people talking about the temperature humidity index. And all that's really doing is putting together humidity and temperature to give us somewhat of an integrated number. It's okay. It's what we're used to working with. And to give you an idea, so the white area is no stress. The yellow area, and you notice the new range starts at 68 degrees, 68 RHI level, okay, where we're already starting to experience some heat stress on the animals. It used to be 70 or 71. There's people that are actually thinking about starting mitigation processes at 65, 66, as we learn more about how sensitive these animals are. In calves, I want you to notice we have the same type of relationship, but the ranges are very different because of their smaller body size and less metabolic heat production. They actually sort of do better at a little bit higher temperature. So instead of 67, 68 as the threshold point to begin heat stress, notice we're at a THI of 73. But they do also experience heat stress. Okay, this is something that we have to keep in mind with our calves and hutches, or any environment that they're in. Again, clean, dry, out of the wind, protected from sun as well. And that's something I see all around the world, is a lot of these baby calves are out there in direct sunlight, which will push them into pretty bad heat stress. This is just to show that there's also a human THI set of ranges compared to what we do for cows. And notice we as humans have a much higher threshold of what we will consider comfortable. All right. We won't really start to feel uncomfortable until we get THIs over 80. And versus a cow that's going to start feeling that discomfort at 67, 68. And it's because of their much greater mass and much greater surface area. And much greater heat production. Okay, now I'm going to show you some numbers that illustrate that here shortly. Within CNCPS, within AMTS though, we don't use THI. We adopted this effective temperature index, and this was actually, we adopted this in CNCPS in the early 1990s. I was working, most of my master's was on environmental impacts on growth. I did quite a fair amount of work on maintenance. And I found that this paper from ASAE, so Association of Agricultural Engineering, where they developed this new method called the effective temperature index. And the beauty of it to me, what really caught my eye was it integrated wind speed as well. So it's temperature, humidity, and wind speed is the base equation. And then there was a paper, an abstract out of Japan from the 80s, where they looked at the heat gain from solar radiation, from some chamber work that they had. So we included that solar radiation. That's what the hours in sunlight relates to. And it basically, if you look at this, it's the equivalent at 10 hours, 11 hours, it would be equivalent to the animal being in a 5 degrees C hotter environment. Okay. And just as an example, it can move an animal from a comfortable area to a heat stress area relatively quickly. This is a picture I took of 2017. Okay, 6 years ago. I was down in Argentina. I've got a little thermal camera that attaches to my iPhone, and we're looking at calves. It was a beautiful day, folks. It was 20 degrees. There was a little bit of a breeze. The sun was out. The calves were lounging, all happy. And then I turn around and I see this cow standing in the laneway near the holding area, and she's panting. She is showing clinical heat stress. And yes, she was a black cow. And I took my camera, and you can see her skin temperature was 42 degrees. Okay. Again, it was 20 degrees outside. So shade, we might not think we need shade when it's 18, 19 degrees C, but folks, we really need to be thinking about heat stress mitigation across all of our animals. And we'll come back to that a little bit later. This whole idea about heat, why we are less sensitive to heat, or when we start to feel less comfortable compared to a cow. I did some quick calculations. I used my Apple Watch and got what my basal energy utilization was, and what my active energy was. So that's 3.1 mcals per day. When I did this was a couple years ago. Used my body weight, and I was actually able to find an equation to calculate the surface area of humans. So my surface area is 2.4 square meters. You look at my energy metabolism per kilo of body weight, it's 27 kcals. And if you look at my energy metabolism per square meter of surface area, 1,273 kcals per square meter. Now we take a cow given 37 liters, okay, about 61 mcals of energy. Let's say she weighs 703 kilos. Her surface area is 5.87, so just about triple, not 2.5 times. But look at her energy metabolism. It's 319% greater energy metabolism per kilo of body weight. Or if we look at it per square meter of surface area, 800% more energy metabolism per square meter. So that's saying this animal, we struggle when it gets hot and how to keep cool and like that. Well, of course, what do we all do? We run into the air conditioning and think, oh, thank God it's hot outside. Yet we got these cows out here at 8 times the energy metabolism that we have in some cases pretty hot environments that we expect her to maintain high levels of performance. So we really need to focus on how we cool these cows efficiently. And remember, cows don't like the heat. Now there's some breed differences. Okay, we get into eared cattle, Bos indicus breeds. They are tropical breeds, are more heat tolerant, but they will still go into heat stress. Then we take Holsteins versus Jerseys. Yes, Jerseys are a little bit more heat tolerant, but most part, we're talking Holsteins. They don't like the heat. You look at the range that cattle like. Okay, their zone of minimal thermal stress is between 0 and 15 degrees C. And actually, cows prefer it colder, and they will increase intake to generate more heat. It's when we start getting into higher temperatures where these animals really struggle. Calves, like I said, a higher range, about 12 to 25 is their ideal range. Some of that depends upon age and body weight of the calf. Little kids up through, the first 6-8 weeks, they definitely are in this higher range of desirable temperatures. And that's true of all babies. Look at piglets versus sows, lambs versus ewes, even chicks versus hens. Okay, younger animals, less insulation, less energy metabolism, prefer higher temperatures. And that really, this range here and these limits here on each end really gets us into what is the LCT, the TNZ, and the UCT. So lower critical temperature and upper critical temperature. Those same concept, okay, opposite ends of the range. There is no single temperature everyone's most comfortable at. It's a range, and that's what the thermoneutral zone is. So here it represents in this hashed area. Okay, we are most comfortable here. But once it drops below this lower critical temperature, the amount of, in this case, heat production that the animal has to do to stay warm increases at an exponential rate. When we look at greater than the upper critical temperature, same thing. Lots of heat to dissipate and more heat generated. We'll come back to that statement in a little while. At the tails of each of these, either above the UCT or below the LCT, if the animal cannot generate enough heat or cannot dissipate adequate amounts of heat, they die. Okay, hypothermia, and can't remember what the one that's after heat stress is. Now, under heat stress, though, we start to see shifts in how the animals lose heat. We'll have more evaporative heat loss and less convective, and we'll come back to that some more too. Yeah, there it is. Hypothermia and hyperthermia. I just got to read my own slides, folks. Okay, so some of this data, we've known about this a long time, and especially the lower critical temperature. You look at a lot of this is referenced back to Blackster, 1967, Webster, 74. All right, there's really nothing here that's newer than 77 in these publications. And if we look at with 1-month-old calves, their lower critical temperature is 0. Whereas a cow giving 65 pounds of milk, minus 40. Okay, they can eat more and keep up with that heat production and heat requirements, that maintenance requirements, because of level of intake and maintenance requirements. So when we get into heat stress, and this is an NRC publication, you can still get it Anymore, it's print by demand. If you go to the National Academy's Press website, I think this is a classic book. I've had this book since I started my master's in the early 90s. And it shows that in hot environments, okay, dissipating metabolic heat, reduced thermal gradient between the body and the environment. Basically, that's saying as the environmental temperature is getting closer to the animal's temperature, her capability to dissipate heat goes down. So what do we normally see? We can see intake reductions to try and reduce heat production, but give you a hint, doesn't work real well. They actually change their metabolism and generate more heat. They sort of become sloppy. And then you throw in there heat gain sources from the environment. And we're really relying on evaporation. And we don't handle that well. And as climate's been changing and as we're seeing along the northern latitudes and extreme southern latitudes, we're seeing these higher temperatures more throughout the year, and really need to be paying attention to this on all of our farms. So common observations under heat stress: lose intake, lose milk volume, milk fat concentration will go down, reproductive efficiency will go down. Heck, I've seen it in dairy cows drop to single digits during heat stress. Hear about farms that don't breed for a couple months during the summer because of extreme heat. Reduced immune function, and there's more and more work being done on that. I'm hoping when Lance gives his webinar, he'll get into some of this more, and the whole concept of leaky gut and all of this as to how it can relate back to heat stress and management issues. Reduce growth, okay, absolutely, same as reducing milk. We're just increased maintenance requirements. And we always see sole ulcers increase about 2 months after heat stress starts, okay? So we'll always have more foot problems. There's a couple of reasons for that. One is just her being unable to cool herself, so there's probably some metabolic shifts that make them more susceptible. But we also know under heat stress, cows stand more. I'll show you some interesting data on that shortly. So, and we also know that previous temperature impacts heat metabolism, okay? This is the difference within the model of why we have current temperature and previous temperature. This is data from beef cattle. And what we'll see is if that animal, let's say that animal was living in an environment that was 20 degrees, and it drops to minus 20. Well, for the first month, they're still going to be thinking that it's 20 degrees until they adapt. Now, vice versa is also true. And I want you to think about this in terms of animals that are used to environments of 0, minus 10 degrees, like what we normally have in the northern parts of the US in January. And we always end up getting these temperature spikes. It may go up to 10 degrees for a couple days. And jackets come off. Everyone feels great, okay, because we're adapted to that lower temperature. And we'll actually see cattle. I've seen cattle experience clinical symptoms of heat stress at 10 or 12 degrees Celsius because their body thinks they're still exposed to this environment. So it's not a huge adjustment when we think about it in terms of formulation, but it is there to represent this metabolic adaptation period, and it can explain some of the differences that we see in production month to month within a herd. So short-term heat stress, this is kind of a fun one. Experience and trials clearly show this, that an animal can withstand short-term heat stress. Okay, and when I say short-term, I'm talking 3-4 days. If the humidity is low, and if there's night cooling. And this night cooling humidity relationship, if we go back and think about THIs, this explains why cows in high deserts can do really well. It might be 42 degrees C during the day and beautiful, hot, but really low humidity. But then it'll drop down to 15 to 20 degrees at night. So overall, that animal, she can soak up some heat during the day, and then when it cools down at night, her body can dissipate that and cool back down. It's a very dynamic system, and that's why we really can't at this time model day-to-day maintenance requirements, because she is so dynamic in managing all of this. If we don't have those nights where it cools down, if we get 4 or 5 nights where it stays 22, 23 at night, animals crash. Okay, they just can't dissipate the heat at night that way. And it's like clockwork, 3 to 5 days. I recently saw some data from robots from Lactanet up in Quebec that clearly showed this even in robots, where number of visits to the robot, milk production, they all drop during heat stress, and about a 2 to 4 day lag of when the heat stress initiated. I think this is a combination of them not being able to dissipate that heat if it doesn't cool down, and it takes time for the buildings, all of our buildings, to get warm. It usually takes 3 to 5 days to get all that concrete mass heated up, and that's why in longer term, we'll see these animals, when it cools down, they don't really start to act more normal, if you want to say that, for 3 to 7 days after the heat stress period ends. I believe a part of that is it takes that long for the buildings to start to cool down, where they can start actually getting into a more comfortable zone where they're living. So when we get into longer term heat stress, moisture, humidity is everything. Controlling moisture balance is super important. We have higher humidity, higher THI, higher environmental ETI, whatever we want. Air movement's important. Okay, air movement's pretty critical. If we're looking in the housing area of animals, 40 to 60 air changes per hour, either through natural ventilation or with the assistance of fans. We really should be in the holding area targeting at least 1 to 2 meters per second of airflow. It's a pretty good wind. And where we place the fans, where we place sprinklers, that becomes pretty critical, because cows spend more time standing. And that's because it's been shown that when they lie down, their core temperature increases about 0.5 degree for every hour that they're lying down. Now, think about this. We want them to lie down, but they're going to get hotter. And I think part of that reason that they get hotter is there's all this surface area that is now touching where they're lying, and they can't dissipate that heat, especially if the building's gotten warm and the beds are warm or hot. I think there is something that limits cooling when they're laying down. When we start looking at respiration rates, okay, clinical heat stress is defined as greater than 60 breaths per minute. And with that, you think about all that respiration, that's how she's getting rid of a lot of heat. That's how she's getting rid of a lot of moisture. She may exhale greater than 15 liters per day. That's a lot of water that is an increase in respiration, okay? That is not basal. So this is water balance and trying to keep these cows hydrated, super critical under heat stress. And we typically see cows bunching in barns during heat stress. And this is an interesting one. This is, I'm not going to discount it, that a lot of the times we'll hear people say it's flies. And yeah, sometimes that's true. Okay. But in farms where fly management, fly control is really good, we still see this bunching. And a lot of that is when you watch where the cows go, they're getting away from light. They're getting away from bright lights because they sense that bright light equals sunlight, which equals solar radiative heat gain. So they're trying to find shade areas to try and minimize that. We can see that when we go into barns during the summer, where you could walk in, half the barn, one whole row of stalls along the outside will be empty. And it's like, why aren't cows using these? Because they're all in the sun. And the girls recognize those are hot areas, so they stay away from them. There was a bunch of engineers that did this a few years ago, where they put thermocouples in cows and looked at lying time, standing time, and body temperature. And as you can see, so here's the orange is lying versus standing. And every time those cows lie down, okay, which is this times, okay, what happens to respiration rate? What happens to body temperature? It always goes up. Okay. So this is a huge reason why cows prefer not to lie down under heat stress, because they get hotter. Now, there's been some work done several times, and I don't know if it's ever been commercialized. I remember seeing some of the early data on it. I think it was done in California, where they were looking at putting instead of radiant floor heat, okay, so they were doing radiant cooling. So they were basically putting loops of PEX piping under the sand in stalls and just running cool water to keep the stalls cool. Some of the initial data I thought looked pretty promising. I don't know if it's ever gone anywhere. If any of you know of that data, or if that type of system's been commercialized, bring it up during the discussion period, because I think that could have some really good potential to help these girls in hotter environments. Okay, so we're really dealing with two types of heat loss in any animal. Okay, sensible heat loss, which is air moving across skin, breathing in cool air, cooling by touching a cool surface. Okay, it's heat loss, heat transfer without a phase change. And then there's latent heat loss that occurs when there's a phase change. So from liquid to gas in terms of water, evaporation, panting, thermal panting. These are the two that we'll talk mostly about. With cows, once the temperature starts getting close to body temperature, okay, sensible heat loss decreases and latent heat loss increases. So at about 27 degrees, about 80% of the heat loss in that animal is latent due to phase change. We see this, along with feed intake. Okay, we get into heat stress. As long, again, that night cooling, they'll come down a little bit, 5-7%. But if it gets above that and we don't have that night cooling, that's when you see these big crashes. Yeah, okay, whatever. Let's look at it a little different way. Let's look at maintenance. Okay, so this is the calculated maintenance requirement as we do in the CNCPS with an AMTS. So this is as a percent of base. So at 0 degrees, their maintenance is up about 10%. At 30 degrees, oh man, their maintenance is up about 10%, okay? Same slope. At 40 degrees, it's up about 30%. So we're generating as much heat in rate of increase as if it's getting cold. yet they can't eat more. They're trying to decrease intake to minimize heat. And at the same time, look at what happens to water per kilo of dry matter intake. Not much of a change here. It starts getting really cold. Their water consumption starts to come down some. But look at this peak, this transition here at about 20. So here's at 27, 28, relying more on sensible heat loss. Then all of a sudden we get above 30 and it increases rapidly. I mean, we're talking 2.5 times greater water requirements per kilo of intake than at thermoneutral. It's because of how she's using respiratory panting, respiratory heat loss to try and dissipate heat. We see, along with this drop in intake, we'll see the drop in milk as well. And we'll start to see that before we really start to see that drop in intake, because just greater maintenance requirements. And when we look at total water consumption, okay, so we go from 65, this is free water, 65, 70 kilos of water required. We hit that 30, they can go from 75, 80 kilos of water required to 120 kilos of water. Okay, so 70% increase in water requirements. That's why we need to reconsider how big and our placements and supplies of water in barns as the environment changes. We need more water availability. Now, we could just do the simple thing, this has been studied and looked at. Why don't we just increase concentrate feeding? And people have tried it, and it really doesn't work. Doesn't work that well at all. May get, if we're very, very low concentrate feeding, we may get a little bit of a production response, but we're still dealing with that drop in intake, and we're still dealing with that increase in energy requirements and increased heat load. It doesn't work. And especially since the question has to become, when we think about this drop in intake and this drop in milk, which came first? Was it the drop in milk, then intake dropped, or vice versa? And it's sort of like asking which came first, the chicken or the egg. So we're going to explore this a little bit. There's a little bit of data out now that we can start to split this apart. And we'll start with protein metabolism. That turns out to be pretty simple. Paper from the Journal of Animals from 2020. And they did gene expression of the mammary gland under heat stress. Little study, not a lot of cows, okay, not high producing cows, not going to, only 8 cows, late lactation, held at low, what they considered low THI of less than 72. They didn't really achieve that full 8 days, okay, but then they went to a moderate, which was 72 to 78. Real simple diets, ad lib hay or some sorghum silage and some concentrate. And when we look at the THI over the study days, the control cows even got up around 70 on THI. So we're getting kind of borderline with the new values that people think that these cows were probably starting to show some heat stress already. But compared to 78 for the heat stress cows, they maintained a good difference between them. And they picked it up in, difference in rectal temperature, with a drop in milk yield. I said, not high producing cows, and they still saw, 2.6 kilos or 2 kilos of fat corrected milk reduction in production by that level of difference in heat stress. Milk fat, in this case, it actually went up. That's an interesting one. Milk protein concentration actually went up. Proportion of casein by different isomers really didn't change, whatever, yada, yada, yada. Gene expression work. Oh, the diet, what happened to intake? Yeah, so 2.5 kilos drop in intake. Okay. Now, I am not a gene jockey. I try to get my head wrapped around some of this, at least enough that I can understand it to explain it. And I'm still not real comfortable doing it, but let's work through this. So what they're looking at is this shift in uh, gene expression. Let's just save it at that. And how does it relate to protein metabolism? And in this case, they're looking at it in terms of casein and whey proteins. And yeah, there was this increase in what they look at fold change ratio. What does it really mean? When I read the rest of the paper, they were like, "Yep, this is really showing that protein metabolism at the mammary glands not really negatively impacted." I don't know. Look up the paper and or ask colleagues, friends that are really deep into this side. What I think is the better slide, the better out of this data is this one, because this is looking at the gene expression of cells of telling cells should they die or not, to protect themselves from heat damage, and they actually saw that under heat stress, these genes were triggered more. So it's basically they're telling the cells, let's we got to control heat, but we're not going to really change our metabolism, and we can manage this. So protein metabolism really doesn't change that much during moderate heat stress, and which is really good because that narrows this back down to it's an energy issue. And the mammary gland is going to do everything it can to protect itself from damage. Now, the interesting one when we think about this is if we think about this in terms of like a transition cow and what we do with immune function and supplementing with amino acids or anything, energy balances and like that, could some of these newer thinking that we do with transition cows, could that have a similar impact on heat stress and really helping the animal and the mammary gland itself improve its immune function? Don't know. There's no data out there looking at that. So energy, we could say it's as simple as this. The cow produces heat. She's got to get rid of that heat. But under heat stress, the environmental temperature is being closer to her temperature. So getting rid of that heat gets more difficult. So she builds up more heat in the body. She tries to change her metabolism, but she gets sloppy at it. So she's actually generating more heat. Now she's got to try and get rid of even more heat. And it's just this cycle. It's a great example of energy spilling where as systems start to fall apart, their efficiency and starts to go down, and thus they have to do more to get diminishing returns, but they have to do more to keep going down this path. And there's some really neat data that we're going to go through that starts to look at this, and it varies. Some of it varies by stage of lactation. Imagine that, where cows that are, this is energy efficiency, gross energy efficiency, first lactation heifers, okay, where it was either below 27 or it exceeded 27 degrees at different stages of lactation. And in early lactation, Yeah, number of days, 0 to 20, where it got above 27. There was a little bit of difference in inefficiencies here. And it was interesting that in this case, the 100 to 200 day cows had the lowest efficiency. The late lactation cows had the highest, but they're not different. Okay. They're not different. We get into 21 to 40 days, we see they all drop in terms of their gross efficiency, basically saying maintenance requirements went up. And 40 to 87 days, a much greater drop. But here, look at what happens. The slope of greater than 100 days, pretty flat. They both drop, and then they're pretty flat after that in terms of we're heat stressed or we're not heat stressed. But with the early lactation cows, as the exposure to heat stress gets longer, their efficiency goes down. So think about all these cows that calve during heat stress and are there. They're supposed to try and reach peak and everything. They're never going to reach as much peak. And we all know what happens when we don't get peak. We lose milk throughout that entire lactation. Now, we throw in there reduced reproductive efficiency, all these things. Heat stress is a complete lactation issue, okay? Especially when fresh cows, I'm going to back up and even say dry cows, when dry cows and fresh cows are exposed to heat stress, that next lactation of theirs is going to suck. Okay. Now, we also know over the last how many years that as milk production's gone up, so it's heat production. All right. And this is going back to 1940 through 99, 95. Okay. This milk energy, this is purely, think of it as milk production, of how we've increased milk production across this time. At the same time, they're saying heat increment. Okay. So the amount of heat that animal is generating has gone up, but not at the same slope as the increase in milk energy. All right. So does that illustrate maybe a little shift in energetic efficiencies? Yeah, maybe, especially if we were to compare it to cows from the 40s. But we don't have cows from the 40s. So looking at it over the last 20 years, it's probably, it's going to be a pretty small thing. It's just that they're generating more heat because they're giving more milk. All right. There's a couple great studies that I'm going to go through, because it really gets to the matter of this drop in intake and this drop in milk. Is it just intake, or is there something else going on? And these were the way they designed these studies. Beautiful design. Pair-fed cows. So the control cows were fed in a thermal neutral environment. Their pairs were in an environment that ranged from 29 to 40 degrees daily. Okay. And whatever their intake was from these heat stress cows, their intake was used for the cows in the thermal neutral area. So it's really controlling for dry matter intake and then looking at everything and trying, if it was just dry matter intake, then things should be real easy to split apart. If it's not, then as you'll see, there's differences in metabolism. So first paper, well, these are the two papers. They're both out of Lance's lab when he was still at Arizona. Both pretty much similar authors on both papers, 2009, 2010 Journal of Dairy Science. They looked at somatotropin, they looked at insulin, they looked at, all sorts of different things. So we'll start with the first one. 2 periods, okay. You see the thermoneutral period is period 1. Surface temperature, rectal temperature, respiration rate. Okay, these are all laid out similarly. thermoneutral versus, or this will turn into the pair-fed and the heat stress cow. You can see surface temperature under heat stress. Yep, they invoke nice surface temperature responses. Rectal temperatures, pretty big differences, 1.5 to 2 degrees difference. And look at the respiration rates they were able to achieve. So we go from basically 30 to, end of the day, spiking at 85 breaths per minute. Did a very good job of invoking heat stress and did a very good job of maintaining those thermoneutral cows consuming the same as the heat stress cows. Perfectly what we wanted to see. We look at milk yield. Wow. Not what we thought we would see. What many people would think you should see, that was an intake difference. So the pair-fed cows, yes, go from full feeding to being restricted feeding based upon the heat stress cows intake. They came down and their level of production kind of held there. Versus the cows that were under heat stress continue to come down in milk. Okay, and we got to a point here where we're talking about a 12 kilo difference in milk production. So that, if we go no further, that right there tells us the drop in milk under heat stress is not purely the response of dry matter intake. There's something else going on. And we can see this. Intake's not different. Overall difference in milk yield. Okay, look at this, 7.5 kilos. Even the control cows, compared to being full fed, 5 kilo difference in milk, 11 kilo drop for the heat stress cows. The components, though, are an interesting one. When we look at what happened to milk fat, okay, the heat stress cows actually gave more milk fat percentage. Shift in metabolism. Protein, yeah, they were a little bit lower. Lactose, no difference. But look at the energy balance. These cows that under the pair-fed were acting more like early lactation cows. Okay, they were losing body weight. They were in negative energy balance. Whereas the heat stress cows didn't really go into negative energy balance. They just downregulated everything. We can see that looking at NEFAs, okay? Heat stress cows, same NEFA levels basically as when they were in full fed thermoneutral, versus the thermoneutral intake limited cows, classical response where we would see NEFAs come way up, showing, basically like a fresh cow going into some subclinical ketosis or even clinical ketosis, acting like starved cows. The heat stress cows did not act that way. And we can see, this difference in milk fat, could some of that difference in milk fat be NEFA related? Maybe, don't know. Milk protein, there was definitely a difference there. Again, though, if that's a shift in metabolism, down regulating energy metabolism, that's going to result in lower milk protein concentrations and yields. So that could be. We look at somatotropin response. Okay, really not much there on the pair-fed cows, but look at what happened to the heat stress cows. There's somatotropin across the board was very different than pair-fed cows and thermoneutral. All right, it's almost like we push these cows way out to the end of their lactation, if we think of it that way. We're shifting their metabolism in a very different direction. IGF-1, okay, is showing the same thing, that these heat stress cows had a continuous decline. And yeah, there's some movement here in the pair feds, but again, that's going to be because of how they dropped in production levels. So we're going to see some of those parallel trends. All right, the second paper. The second paper, they added a third treatment where they third period where they gave both groups of cows somatotropin. So I don't know if we'll really get into that. I mean, but it kind of tells a little bit more to the story. Same design, same everything. And you can see they did a really good job of invoking heat stress in those girls, getting up to 90, 89, 90 breaths per minute respiration rate versus 38, 39 for the cows held in thermoneutral. Okay. Similar responses to the first study, no difference in intakes. Different, kilo and a half difference in milk, a couple kilos difference there. Again, the heat stress cows had higher milk fat than the pair-fed cows, but lower milk protein concentrations unless they were given somatotropin. That's where it gets confusing, so we won't talk much about that. Okay, so similar type of responses. You can see intakes, just like design, milk yield, see the same thing where those heat stress cows stayed lower, and actually some of their difference started to get wider as the periods of heat stress got longer. Energy balance, in this case, both groups were showing negative energy balance. But when we look at NEFAs, again, those heat stress cows, in this case, did have higher NEFAs than when they were in thermoneutral and full fed. So they were a little bit lower. They were a little low in energy balance. But look at the pair-fed cows. We're talking more than double the NEFA concentrations. So again, pair-fed under thermoneutral is acting like starving animals. They are mobilizing body fat to try and get as much energy as they can, whereas the heat stress cows changed their metabolism and changed their sensitivity to insulin, glucose. You look at their insulin levels, they're higher. This study, they did measure insulin, significantly higher insulin levels. So they're acting metabolically differently. NEFAs, we can see this, over time, that big shift going on with the pair-fed cows. No difference really in PUNs. And with those increased insulin levels, so we got decreased mobilization of lipids, increased glucose utilization by peripheral tissues. So the whole normal glucose mechanisms to control thermoneutral can't be engaged by severely heat stressed cows. So again, she is shifting her metabolism to downregulate energy metabolism, downregulate heat production. In study 1, the reduction in intake accounted for about 35% of the difference in the milk loss. Study 2, it was about 50%. So intake by itself, the drops in intake under heat stress, 50 to 60% of it, of the drop in milk loss, is related to the drop in intake. The rest of it is due to changes in her basic metabolic functions. So doing things to try and stimulate intake and like that, they will help. But unless we get into really good cow cooling systems, their network, just addressing the intake issue, is never going to get us back to where those cows potentially can be. And the other thing to remember, there's a few things to remember when we lose intake. So we have passage rate decreases. Okay, it's a continuous flow or plug flow fermentation, that before something can come in, an equal amount has to go out. So if she's eating less, it's going to go through slower. And we think about that. So we then have, a little bit less rumen motility. Overall, GI tract motility is decreased. And in non-ruminants, this is also related to hyperthyroidism. And if things aren't moving through as fast, think about that. Could this also be in some of our diets that could be prone to acidosis or SARA, where the acids aren't leaving the rumen as quick as they were, or we're getting greater starch digestibility because of the decreased passage rate. So we get more acid production, and then we can get a little bit more subclinical acidosis possibly. Definitely experiences with that known around the world. And they've also found that heat stress triggers the satiety centers of the brain, so that'll decrease intake as well. Which, hey, I get that. I mean, whenever it gets really hot out, I know what happens to my desire to eat. It goes down. And this is all just a natural response by animals to reduce heat production. All right, some of a review paper from early 2000. And this gets a little messy because it gets into thinking about DCAD and buffering, and hopefully I get it right when I go through it, because it can get a little messy. Okay, so because of the increase in respiration rate, because the cow is trying to cool and trying to move all this water out through her system, she might see her blood CO2 levels go down. All right, so we see blood pH go up. She's fighting like mad to maintain a normal blood buffering capacity, and in a desire to reduce this CO2, or because of this lower CO2, she's trying to dump bicarbonate. So she then is breathing more, and it is this kind of this vicious cycle, and that increased respiration increases oxygen levels. If we look at blood and urine numbers, we see creatinine levels go up. Okay, that's kind of suggesting muscle catabolism. So while she may be showing respiratory alkalosis, she could actually be showing some signs of she could actually be somewhat metabolically acidotic. It gets tricky, folks. Yeah, I'm going to skip that. All right, increased secretion of potassium in sweat. Okay, so as under heat stress and she's sweating and she's, so she's dumping potassium, she's dumping carbonate. So coupled with the increase in elevated water balance because of how much she needs to drink, it's been pretty well shown that cows are not maintaining plasma sodium, potassium, and chloride homeostasis and plasma volume. These cows are actually dehydrated. They are their buffering capacity is lower, and they could be metabolic acidosis. Okay, so respiratory alkalosis, but metabolic acidosis, more sodium, more potassium because of sweat and just what they're dumping out in their system and in their urine, and because of the increased water balance, water requirements and everything. There is some data, there's growing data about increasing DCAD in heat stress cows. Is there some rumen impact? Yeah, probably. I don't even think about any of this really anymore as rumen issues. I think more and more of what we have to think about in terms of DCAD is post-absorptive, and We actually are manipulating the acid-base balance of the animal and the buffering capacity of the animal. Some really neat data. There's a little bit of data out there that shows that cows fed bicarb versus salt had lower body temperature during heat stress. So I'm looking at it in terms of I'm going to do everything I can to support the metabolic process of the animal. And like I said, I think most of it is post-absorption related. All right, how do we feed these cows? You know, there's a few different approaches. We could formulate like any other time of the year and just say, yep, heat stress is there. We could do like any other time of the year, but increase DCAD. Okay, we could do that. We could try to reduce forage, increase concentrate amounts, and try to limit how much milk we lose. I know people who have tried to do that. I know people that have tried to stimulate intake and maintain production at a lower dry matter intake. Know people that have tried that as well. Remember, no matter what, rumen's generating heat. We got lower intake, passage rates lower. And not only are sodium and potassium levels lower in the animal, but they're also lower in the rumen because of the sweating. So all of these things all together, we end up with this increased risk for sera. So is increasing concentrate a good thing? I don't know. Probably not my first choice. If we decrease forage levels, now it can be done, okay? But we've got to keep NDF levels where they belong. Okay, if we're going to decrease forage, you know, this is a table 4.3 out of the 2001 dairy NRC. I added the fermentable starch. 2001 NRC doesn't have starch in there. So, you know, if we're going to be reducing forage levels, minimum forage dry NDF levels, our total dietary NDF needs to go up with it, and our NFC levels need to come down. So we keep this balanced. We've got to do everything to keep that rumen healthy. All right. If you don't, you're going to push cows into acidosis. And to me, I think it's much, much more important that we maintain a healthy rumen during heat stress. She's battling all these metabolic insults. And if we throw another one on there related to heat stress and related to sera, I think it's in this case, it's not 1 + 1 = 2. It's 1 + 1 = dead cow. So we've got to be thoughtful of maintaining rumen health, and at the same time, working with our producers to implement good cow cooling strategies. We can do some added fat out there. There's some work that shows adding fat during heat stress does give some increase in milk yield. But again, keeping it within realistic ranges of, you know, I got the range here. I got, you know, the maximum here is 7. That really, I've never fed that high. You know, I might hit 6 or a little over 6. But let's not go overboard on fat, especially since, you know, what type of fat should we be feeding? You know, man, you go through that fat literature, you walk out of the room shaking your head, wondering what is this guy really blue, or is it teal, or is it sky blue, whatever. It's not very clear, at least to me. But it is kind of consistent that we should be using a mix of fatty acids. Okay, so a blend of C16, 18, 18-1 appears to give the most consistent response. Prills, you know, form of the fat, either prills or calcium salts or whatever. I don't care, really. But I think there's some handling issues that need to be considered. like especially like with the prills, when we start getting above 30 degrees, are they going to start to clump? Are they going to start to get sticky? Are they going to start to melt? Feeding fat on by bulk on farm, probably not that big of a deal. Trying to run that through a feed mill probably gets to be a big deal. I just throw Megalac on there as a brand name, as an example of a calcium salt. There's, the calcium salts of all different brands and flavors out there. But again, a mix of fatty acids is the key thing. Now, remember that dry cow I showed earlier? I come back to her because I tell people anymore, if you give me $100 to spend on heat stress mitigation on your farm, $50 of it is going to go to putting in soakers and fans in the holding area, and the other $50 immediately is going to go to the dry cow cooling. Be it shade or whatever, fans. Do we need soakers on dry cows? Yeah, I believe we do. Especially when we see data like this and some of the other data out of Florida, where you look at these cows, dry cows under heat stress versus not heat stress. These cows all calve 2 to 6 days earlier, and look at the birth weight differences, anywhere from 6 to 30% lower birth weight on those calves born under heat stress. What I don't have is a slide in this presentation. It is, go back to the work from that's been coming out of Florida the last several years, where calves born out of heat stress dry cows were smaller, yes, grew less during weaning. They actually had their insulin responses were different. So their metabolism's different. Gave less milk in the first lactation. And now they've got more and more of these animals going through the second lactation, gave less milk in the second lactation as well. Think about that. Being exposed in utero to heat stress, having a lifelong negative response on productivity of those animals. Folks, long-term strategy, long-term profitability thinking in the dairy industry, cool the damn dry cows, has a long-term effect. All right, when I'm formulating, I formulate like I do on any diet. Keep the rumen healthy, digestible forages, digestible NDF, supplement with fats if I don't need extra energy, enough rumen ammonia, bypass proteins, amino acids. Okay. And I do pay attention to DCAD, more so in heat stress. I've gotten to the point throughout lactation. I try to keep my DCADs at least 300 milliequivalents per kilo, maybe 350. I might go a little bit higher in heat stress. I don't know yet. And I do it with bicarb or sodium sescarb, just because it's the cheapest way to increase DCAD. I could go potassium if I need to. I hold that in kind of reserve, or in areas where sodium, but where bicarbonate like that is hard to get or is expensive. But it is more expensive. And remember, it's got to be potassium carbonate, okay, or something like that. It can't be potassium chloride, just like you can't use sodium chloride to supply sodium. From a DCAD perspective, they both are zero. They're balanced. So we're not adding any positive to the overall buffering system of the animal. Then I work with the farms to focus on things like water trough availability and cleanliness, fresh feed. Should we feed twice a day, or can we still feed once a day and just push up feed every couple hours? Are all the fans working? And are the fans clean? Yeah, the damn thing might turn on, but if there's 2 inches of dust and cobwebs and crap all around it, it's not going to be efficient. You can measure it. I've measured it with an animator. We can lose 30 to 60% of the airflow because of the fan screen shroud being dirty. If we're using soakers and we have to use soakers, are the settings correct? Are they angled correctly? Is there adequate water flow? And if the animals are going to be outside, shade. Do they have shade? Same with hutches, can we get shade over the hutches? I know it sounds crazy, but in these high sunlight areas, that's pretty damn important. So, I truly believe it is impossible to outfeed heat stress. We should not be going crazy trying to come up with a heat stress magical diet. We need to follow good nutritional strategies. It's part of the heat mitigation plan. We can do things like improve our fiber digestibility if possible, increase DCAD, be supportive of that cow. But the most important in dealing with managing heat stress on farm is farm management. They have to be willing to invest in the appropriate cooling systems. They have to try and not overcow these cows in heat stress areas, and they have to be paying attention to the details to keep these girls eating, milking, breeding, surviving. All right, that is the end, and let's get into questions.
For the convenience of the global audience that joins us for the webinars, we offer the recorded webinars twice on webinar day and record the question and answer session for each. For this reason, you may observe repetition in the questions. Additionally, we take the recording once posted and convert it into a podcast so that you can listen to them as you're driving. Before continuing with the webinar, I would introduce the next webinar on June 1st. For that webinar, I will be joined by Dr. Bill Prokop of Dairy Innovations, LLC. He will cover some of the management aspects effective for heat stress amelioration. So, hi, Marty. Thanks for coming.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Martin.
Tom. Seems like we've had conversations about this several times over the years.
Once or twice.
Yeah.
So, Marty, what are some of your insight working where you do on how what you're using to mitigate heat stress? And do I remember correctly, you were also working on a product or an app that was helping with that mitigation?
No, I have an acquaintance that has an application for calculating THI. It's available in the Apple Store as well as the Google or Android. There's an issue right now in that he was depending on a service provided by a company called Dark Sky, which was purchased by Apple
that was
within the
my
last couple
favorite
of years.
weather app, and they took it down.
Yep. So Apple is limiting the use of that of the company that they own. So he's currently looking for a different provider of the weather information to update his application. But it was an application that would, depending on if you're using the free version or a paid version, the free version would estimate out to 3 days of a predicted THI for every hour of the day, and the paid version would go out to 7 days, which was quite useful. But I sent him a message last week when the program wasn't updating the information, and he said he's currently looking for a new provider of that information. Hopefully he finds one soon.
He can't use the Apple Weather Kit API?
I don't think so. I believe he was for a while, because Apple bought Dark Sky over a year ago, and it was just a week or two ago when the application has not been able to update. So I suspect that there's been some sort of change between the app developers and Apple with very recently.
That's sad because so Marty, if you would, if you send me the information, I will share it out on the webinar page in hopes that maybe that gets resolved.
Sure. I can send that to you later today.
Perfect. Thank you. Other thoughts?
Well, I think it was last year I gave a presentation about how we deal with heat stress down here in Mexico, which we do have quite a bit of. In fact, one number of the farms we're touching THIs of 75, 76, or maybe even a little bit more right now here where I live. Cow resting times are down to 9 hours or a little bit less. Evaporative cooling is taking place basically almost 24 hours a day right now. So we're getting into the heat stress time down here. A couple of comments. I think Tom talked about a little bit about problems with the hooves or the feet of the cows. Part of that might be due to all this extra water that we're pouring on the cows, and the hoof is going to be wet for a much longer period of time than it would be during different parts of the year, which may be leading to a cause with hoof health issues.
That definitely depends upon how water is applied, how much water is applied, and yeah, if the floors are getting wet or if they're getting into mud. Absolutely, Marty.
Yep, and I think one of the strategies that I apply on some of the farms is to 6 to 8 weeks increase zinc levels in the mineral formulation to help with toughening up that hoof so that we don't have quite as many hoof problems during the hot weather. Biotin might be another vitamin to add in along with that for protection of the hooves.
Yep.
Is that related to some of the acidosis potential? Does that increase the potentiality for hoof problems?
Longer term, probably. It's just these girls are spending a hell of a lot more time on their feet with heat stress than thermoneutral. And anything that causes them to stand more, it's just terrible.
Yeah. I had a couple questions, but so is it possible with increasing incidences of heat stress, if you can't manage it out through cooling systems, what validity would using genetics? Am I correct in thinking that maybe in places like Brazil, they have some other breeds brought in crosses that help with managing some of the heat stress in those countries? Or do you take too great a hit in milk production to make that viable? Or do you not have a choice?
No, that's a really good question, Marianne. And actually, we get into Brazil, and there's a lot of crossbreeding with Gur. So there's a lot of Holstein Gur. There's even people milking pure Gur in Brazil, and those cows that breed is a lot more heat tolerant. And you look at them; they've got these big floppy ears. They make Swiss ears look small. They have a less than desirable personality towards humans, but they can produce really well. I've been on Holstein Gur herds in the middle of summer that were producing, 37, 38 liters.
So that definitely is an option to improve our resiliency to heat stress. We also know, for example, jerseys are a little bit more heat tolerant. It's, everyone's chased Holsteins because of high volume, high production, but Holsteins are not always the best fit for the local environments. And we've need to consider that as we look at breeding systems and changing production systems in various parts of the world.
So, Tom, you work with a fair number of herds down in Texas that have either Jersey herds or crossbreeding. And I'm going to drag in Ron Solomon has a comment about excessive water in the Standing Alley may raise manure issue handling. Would you get like a little bit of alleviation through jerseys as well through that, less manure? Or is that a stretch? You know how I love my brown.
That's a stretch. You love brown cows. I mean, sure, they're going to give a little bit less manure because their intakes are lower, but we've also got to come back to, I think it's a combination of how do we manage things with heat stress, but also what is the local milk market? If the local milk market is 90% volume fluid milk based, then yeah, I mean, jerseys aren't going to fit as well. If they're in a cheese production area or like that, it's at the end of the day, it's a balancing act between how do we manage heat stress, how do we manage repro, and how do we manage income and maximizing income for the farm across all these scenarios.
I'm wondering if shifting, we're seeing some market shift from fluid milk into either cheese production or components like whey and sort of solid extraction, or even we just had big news in our area about a Fairlife plant going in the area where does that give a benefit to a breed that has higher components, lower volume?
All depends on how many kilos of solids we produce and what that market is.
Mm-hmm.
There's no single answer. There's no single answer.
Yeah, and there never is. Coming to a question, how important is the coat color to reduce heat load under grazing conditions?
That is a great question. And yes, black cows are way more heat absorbing beast than white cows. There used to be an ag engineer at Cornell who actually had worked on this a lot. He actually had even created a model, and there's a significant difference in heat load based on skin color and hair color. So could I put production numbers on it? No, because that data in all of his work never went that far. But there is, just using my thermal camera, you can easily pick up differences. Well, hell, that picture of that cow, that dry cow that I've got in the slides, she was a black cow. And if there was a black and white cow near her, I don't know if I have any pictures of them, but you can definitely see a skin temperature difference between the black and the white areas.
I
don't think anyone's ever gone as far as looking at what potential total heat stress load, heat load, and differences in production are based on hair color.
I was just going to second what Tom was saying, that if you take one of these photos of a cow that has black and white markings, you will find that the darker areas have a higher temperature. or will read at a higher temperature than what the white hair color will. And it's pretty obvious. You can actually see the pattern of markings in the photo.
Let me see if I can find.
Yeah, and you can let me make it so that you can take away my screen. I'm unhappy with my thing anyway. So the comment Ron had was overly wet manure, not less, which is harder to handle, is what he was shooting at.
Yep, absolutely. Absolutely.
Marty, I'll ask this of you while Tom's searching.
I've got one. I just can't figure out how the hell is. Oh, yeah, I got to go to
Let me stop share. I'll
Yeah.
stop share. Okay. And by the way, I made it so you could start your video. I'm a little slow this morning.
That's actually a calf.
Oh, wow.
Okay, and you can see white spots versus black spots. So yeah, pretty big differences. But I have no idea how that would translate back to respiration rate or heat load. Can't think of any work that's published that's looked at that. There might be some in some of the ag engineering journals. I'm not sure.
Tom, coming back to the genetic aspect and incorporating some GER, they also have a greater resistance to parasites. Wondering if we're seeing increasing temperature situations, will there be also an increase in potential for parasites?
Oh, absolutely. We're already seeing that. If we even look at it from these cows, let me say this, these cows are actually in a tunnel ventilated barn, and they were GER Holstein crosses. And you can see that difference in skin temperature. But we're already seeing that. We're already seeing that, Marianne, in relation to the parasites. Hell, just look at what we've had in relation to ticks and Lyme disease.
Oh yeah.
Here in the Northeast US, 10 years ago, it was cold enough during the winter that ticks would become, non-existent. They would go into hibernation and freeze. In the last few years, we've seen ticks throughout the winter. So we are definitely we in the Northern Hemisphere, we have been very used to having frost and extreme temperatures clean up the environment for us. And that's slowly going away. I mean, we're seeing it even on farms with increased incidence of be it clostridials in calves throughout the year, coccidiosis, definitely. Calves raised in hutches outside. We never used to really think about rota and corona that much during the winter. And we're seeing increased incidence of this all over the place. So yeah, we are definitely seeing shifts in parasites and we're going to have to be thinking about enhanced control of those as weather continues to change on us.
It's never simple. And it's never one thing.
Nope.
Yeah. Well, I'm gonna, unless Marty and Tom, unless you have other points you want to make, and I get any more questions, I'm gonna say let's wind this up for the morning. We'll be back again in the afternoon. I don't think Marty's joining me.
No, I will not be.
Thank you for coming this morning. I did have a message from Elena apologizing for not joining this morning. She got tied up on a farm. Do have a question. Any of the large dairy farms utilizing shade cloth over your areas where the calf hutches are? This person, Wendy Beard, is located in Missouri.
I've seen it on some farms in the Southwest, and we definitely need to do more of that. If you look at temperatures inside those hutches during the summer, they're little ovens. That's why we see the calves wanting to be outside. Even though it's direct sun there, it's still cooler.
Yeah,
My
we have.
husband.
I'm
Oh,
sorry.
sorry, Marty. Go ahead.
We have some farms down here that use shade over the calf hutches during the summer, and what Tom is saying is correct. If there are sand bedded hutches, the sand will get up to 50 degrees Celsius or higher. And if it's a tin roof or a laminated roof on the hutch, that can also get to 55 to 60 degrees underneath. So it's an oven for those little girls if the orientation is wrong. It's unfortunately a lot of the calf setups or the hutch setups are for the benefit of the feeders rather than for the benefit of the animal.
The farm that my husband used to be on, we actually had one back when greenhouses were thought to be the answer. They put in a greenhouse and utilized some of the greenhouse technologies of thermal regulating with shade cloth and moving it back and forth to open up and close. And they had really good ventilation. I think it was a fairly effective greenhouse in terms of that. But yeah, that would definitely use shade cloth, and it was quite comfortable winter and summer in that situation. Anything else? All right. Well, thank you everybody for joining. I'm going to work this afternoon or this late morning on cleaning up some of those slides, see if I can get them a little clearer in the recording. And I think some of it has to do with speed on the receiving end as well. So they are a little blurry, some of them, but mostly I think it's a combination of factors. Tom, thank you. And
What time
Marty, thank you for joining. Everybody who joined, thanks very much. And we'll see some of you tonight.
What time tonight, Marianne?
Oh, I'm sorry. You don't have to join until 7-ish.
All right, cool.
All right.
I'm like under the gun because I leave for Japan tomorrow.
I know. This is you got, I'm sure you got a lot to do. So thanks a bunch.
All right, later, everyone.
Right. Bye, everybody.
So long.
Bye, Marty.
Bye, Tom. Have a good trip.
Yep,
See you
thanks.
in June, Marty.
See you in June.
Yep.
Bye.
Right.
All right, let's get to some of the questions. Paula, do you I'm going to ask Marcelo, since he sent this question in a bit ago. Marcelo, do you want to ask the question that you have in the chat window about robots, or do you want me to read it? Marcelo?
No, Mary, go ahead. You can read. Thank you.
I can read, sure. So Marcelo says, very good. Tom, please talk about cow cooling with robotic milking, the challenges and the opportunities.
Yeah, I saw that, and I actually replied in the chat window to Marcelo. It is a nightmare. There's not a lot of data out there. Okay, this is one of those places where I think there needs to be some more work. The little bit of work that's been done has looked at, where to place soakers, and the one definitive thing that people say is do not place soakers on the entry to the robot, because the cows won't have enough time there to actually get wet and then dry off. And we also don't have a lot of fans around those areas. So that's not a great place to do them. If we have cut gates on the exit of the robots, maybe put them on an exit way, but it still isn't ideal. I've seen a lot of people put ceiling fans, like from houses, in the robot in the box above the cow. That probably helps a little. The overall recommendation right now still is feed line soakers and lots of fans, just like it would be in a normal, in a parlor situation. I think there's opportunities there for us to look a lot more at fan placement, air movement around the boxes. And I don't know of anyone working in that area. So I think there needs to be some trial and error things that we have to do with boxes.
When I visit Sam in June, I'll see what he's doing.
He's cheap, probably nothing.
He's very cheap, yeah. But he should know better. Anyway, Paula, would you like to ask some of your questions? Unless you want me to ask them. Okay, Paula's coming.
I was going to say it's quiet from Argentina. Yay!
Microphone work. Let's see. Paula, I'm going to ask the first question. And then if you get your microphone working, you can just butt in because, don't hesitate to interrupt Tom. In fresh cows, what do you recommend in terms of frequency and length of cooling?
Wow, I'm going to punt on that question and let's go through that with Bill's webinar next month because Bill addresses some of those things a lot.
Okay, perfectly. You're going to answer, well, he'll address it, but you're going to answer any questions about it.
Yeah, I know, but still, he addresses a lot of that.
Just reminding you. Let's see, Paula, shall I keep going? Yes, okay. If you use potassium, how much would you add? If you could use it.
It's going to depend on how high I want to drive DCAT up. I'm not going to stand here and say, that we should be looking at a specific potassium level in the diet. I'm going to say, let's think about this from a whole system standpoint. Let's start off with whatever's cheaper, a sodium source or potassium source. Drive, if we're starting off with a sodium source, then run sodiums up as high as 0.65% of dry matter. And then if we want to run DCAT up higher than that, then potassium. And, the max response that people have seen with DCAT has been going up as high as around plus 600. That's damn expensive, folks. I think that 350, 400 is going to be a cost-effective level to be at and still give us positive responses. Remember, if you're going to look at potassium, you got to watch your source. You can't use, people want to go, oh, what's the cheapest source? And it's potassium chloride. From a DCAD standpoint, that doesn't do squat because it's balanced. So we got to be looking at potassium carbonate, potassium bicarbonate. So we're getting into things that are a lot more expensive. I know some people that are actually using, I'm not going to condone or support this, but I know people using potash fertilizer as a potassium source. So how well does it work? What's its digestibility? I don't know, but it's got to be something that's going to actually add positive DCAD. Okay.
I'm going to go to a question I have in the question window, and then we'll come back to Paula's question. So this is from Mario Zoni. Considering the use of energy to mitigate the heat stress associated with a drop in dry matter intake, what would be a good strategy in properties with little availability of water for sprinkling? Increase the speed of ventilation? Is that an option?
Increasing wind speed, increasing airspeed helps a little, but minimal. We know, in the US as an example, over the last, and I've seen some in Brazil, some of these tunnel ventilated barns. And a good designed tunnel ventilation system will have a consistent 8 to 16 or 8 to 10 kilometer, 8 to 12 kilometer per hour wind speed. It helps. It definitely helps a lot, but it still is not as effective as getting these cows wet. The only way to get these animals to cool and dissipate heat is with the use of water. So if you're in an area with limited water availability, you will get by wind speed, air movement, you'll get 25% of the potential benefit of using water and actually soaking the cows. You're not going to get, you're never going to get close to using water.
I'm trying to recall something that Bill said maybe in a few talks ago about misters, but is misters just too challenging? That would use less water, but is that too challenging to
It's
actually have
tricky.
a mist?
It's tricky because if you use misters, it has to be with high velocity fans. Because you have to actually blast that water, that mist, through the hair coat. If you just use a mist and it coats the animal and doesn't actually soak through the hair coat, you'll actually make the animal hotter.
Right.
And it also depends on where we're talking geographically. If we're talking in an environment that's hot and low humidity, then some of these misters that are used, actually that mist evaporates before it hits the ground, and it's actually cooling the air. Those are super expensive systems. And when they've done cost benefit analysis of minimal fans and these full high velocity misters to cool the air, it actually, the return on investment was minimal compared to just living with the drop in production and drop in repro efficiency.
Okay. Paul is still struggling with her microphone. I just tried changing her to host, thinking that maybe that will make it so that she can speak, but I'm not sure. Anyway, I'll keep going. She can try to unmute, because I loved it when Zoom let me mute and unmute people at will, but they took that away. Apparently people abused it. It wasn't me. This is a question from Paula's audience. What do you think of using propylene glycol to increase energy density under heat stress?
It's going to be a waste of money because really, the only way propylene glycol actually enhances energy to the animal is given as a drench. If it's just being added to a TMR, it's a 3-carbon compound that's going to be degraded in the rumen, and you might as well and it's really expensive, so just add some more fermentable starch or fermentable sugar.
Okay. What is your opinion of using sorbitol in pre-fresh and fresh periods under heat stress to increase?
I have none because I've never done it, and I don't know of any data about it, so I won't say.
Okay. So while I've run out of questions in my window and Paula's window, but I'm going to bring up a topic we talked about this morning that for this group, and maybe Marcelo would give some weigh in on this, is using some crosses with GER cattle to help mitigate and manage heat stress.
He's not going to say anything. It can work great. It can work great, but just remember those GER cows can be pretty human unfriendly. and you can do great production levels with them. I've been on GER herds doing 37, 38 liters. And from a biology and metabolic standpoint, it does make sense because they are more heat tolerant, a lot more heat tolerant. It does bring in, a lot of challenges. I think with any crossbreeding program, I didn't say this morning. Any crossbreeding program in the dairy industry, there's damn few people around the world that do it correctly. Everyone screws it up because they try and stick with two breeds. And we know, this has been known in the beef industry for many, many years that, crossbreeding is great on a terminal cross. But if you've got a 50-50 Holstein GER cow, what the hell are you going to breed her to? If you breed her back to a Holstein, she's going to be, or to a GER, it doesn't matter. That F2 is less productive, less efficient than her parent. So the only way to really do crossbreeding correctly, you got to have 3 or 4 breeds. And now we're starting to get into a record keeping nightmare. So it's tricky. It's really tricky.
Okay.
Hi, Miriam.
Hi, Marcelo. How are you?
Yeah, just to make a comment, we have a measure here in Brazil, some herds in Mauricio, at Passos, Minas Gerais, and the cows that are crossbred, if they're the same level of production of the Holsteins, it's the same challenge with the heat stress. Exactly the same thing. They would have put data loggers, Tom showed that, and AMTS shows that, the biggest challenge for cows, the milk production is the biggest driver of energy. So if they're producing 40, 45 kilos, no matter what you do, they're going to have challenge with heat stress. The crossbred, whoever uses crossbred, for the most part, they have lower milk production. So in the end, is the milk production level effect, in my opinion, not really the crossbred effect.
Awesome. Thank you, Marcelo.
You're welcome, my man.
All right. Marcelo, anything more you want to ask or say?
No, it's a wonderful webinar. Excellent. Tom is doing great, just like I taught him. So I'm very
Asshole.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining. Marty, how are anything you want to add or contribute? And I'm going to put you on the spot, Marty, and Paula will thank me for this. I'm going to ask you to sort of do a little recording of the explanation of those pictures in English and then also in Spanish so that Paula can feed it right in.
No hablo inglés.
Okay. Paula says perfect.
Awesome.
I cannot say what she just spelled. All right. And Paula, thank you so much. We miss your voice. Hopefully we'll get this figured out. Tom, have a great trip to Japan.
I hope so.
And as always, take pictures. And
Never. See you in a couple weeks.
I know. Well, Lynn will be there. She'll take pictures.
True. Yeah.
All right.
Tokyo. Okay.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. We'll see you in a shorter period of time in June. And Paula, because she had the great translation skills again of Paula Alanes. Great to have their team back on board. So thank you, everybody. Have a good evening. Safe flights, Tom. And thanks, everybody, for joining us. Bye. I am delighted to co-host this series with Dr. Paula Turillo from Afina in Argentina and Dr. Bill Prokop from Dairy Innovations. We also share hosting honors with several of our AMTS distributors. Dr. Marty Traxler of La Tech, distributor in Mexico, Dr. Elena Bonfante of Dairy Innovations Italia, our Italian distributor, Dr. Sean Lee of ANSI-Tech, AMTS distributor in China, and Dr. Marcelo Hens Ramos of 3R Lab and AMTS distributor in Brazil. I am also joined by my colleagues Lynn Gilbert and Tom Tylutki of AMTS. We wish to thank our wonderful sponsors who allow us to pay our speakers and help justify our time commitment to this project. We thank our gold sponsors, Arm & Hammer Animal and Food Production, #ScienceHearted, the Canola Council of Canada. Discover the amazing value of canola meal at canolamazing.com. Adina, experts in animal nutrition with expertise in plant bioactives, and Protetka, transforming the future of farm animal health. Our silver sponsors this year are the Forage Analysis Labs of Dairyland Laboratory with affiliates around the world, and Adiseo Ruminant Nutrition Solutions to ensure animal performance. Our bronze sponsors are AminoMax, Virtus Nutrition, Balchem, the Milk Group, and Barron's. Each of these companies support education and research worldwide. We hope you consider them in your formulation decisions. Thank you so much for joining us to listen to this recorded webinar, and we hope to see you in our next webinar.